Good morning, everyone. Good morning, and in Europe, good afternoon. In APAC, if you're watching, good evening, wherever you are. It's so fantastic to be back with you. Day 3 of the annual NeuroLeadership Summit, where we're all in a virtual world, it seems, but also connecting more than ever. It's been an incredible 2 days. Hopefully, many of you have logged into what's there and some of the sessions we've done. This is a week when we really try to push our own envelope and really push out into the world the right kind of science that can really make a change. And at NLI, we're all about making organizations better for humans through science. And it's been quite a year for that. It's amazing to see companies caring about humans a lot more. And, you know, when the pandemic first hit, I was thinking, wow, diversity, equity, inclusion might actually take a back seat this year. I was a little anxious that people may care less about this kind of thing. And, you know, just for the first kind of month or so, and just we were completely wrong about that. It's been a year where actually respecting all humans has become just such a big priority, and in particular, you know, people that have suffered in other ways in the past. But let's dig into what a session I'm really excited about. We've really worked on this all year. I'll introduce our team. We've got Leonard from BMS. We've worked with Linda for a couple of years, developing a very custom approach to inclusion that's scaling right across the organization there. Linda, great to have you with us.
Thanks, David. Hey, everybody.
It's been great to work with you and all those incredible smart scientists that are doing amazing work along with other farmers to keep us all safe. And we have Ester Neznanova, who is the head of our diversity and inclusion practice, working closely on all of this over the last few years. Welcome, Esther.
Hey, everyone. Excited to be here.
Great to have you. And Soledad O'Brien, who has her own organization making some incredible videos and incredible work out there that's changing the world. And many of you would know her from her time on CNN and other places. And Soledad, great to have you with us.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
To have you with us. And then last but not least, we have, Barbara Steele. Sorry, just go there. Barbara Steele, who actually heads our performance practice, which has become a lot about actually breaking bias and addressing organizational systems around D&I as well. She's going to weigh in on some of the systems work that we've been doing today as well. So she's one of our leaders at NLI. So let's dig in. How do we really address D&I in a strategic way? I mean, the short answer at NLI, you could probably guess how we think about this, is 3 words: follow the science. And I do want to make a point that we didn't launch a DEI practice kind of this year. We started working in this space in 2012 and published in 2014 a pretty significant piece of research, and then have continued to publish now 8 fairly important pieces of research across bias, inclusion, speaking up, perspective taking, recruiting, power, gender, all sorts of really important issues. And any one of these papers you could read, and if you really process it and digest it and apply it, you find could be pretty transformational. This is the real science of how to do this work. I am not going to try with the team to explain everything in all these papers. What we want to do is talk about what really matters when it comes to leading around DEI. And I want to just, anchor and say, we think that 2021 is an incredible opportunity to really do the right thing in this space. But, this year a lot happened. Some of you will have seen, I guess, the piece that we wrote earlier in the year, came out in June, Listen Deeply, Unite Widely, Act Boldly. It's a year when leaders were kind of scrambling for, what do we do? How do we actually approach this? And we said, actually the very first thing you need to do is listen deeply. And a lot of companies took that very seriously this year, ran some incredible listening circles and town halls, and really started to listen to their people at a new level, which was inspiring to see. Then unite widely and act boldly. And I think the act boldly part has been very challenging for organizations. Does it mean put a lot of money in? Does it mean invest in completely different ways? Or what does it mean? We're going to focus on what we think it means internally inside your organizations, which is something that organizations can control. And of course, there are external things you can do that can be very, very bold and very powerful. But in particular, internally, we want to help you navigate this tension that's been here this year of, do you do things right now or do you do things right? And which one do you do? And so how do you navigate that? And we want to do our very best to answer that question and show you kind of how to do both, how to do things both right now as well as right. Although for us right now, it means like an incredibly thoughtful 2021 plan versus just kind of something right now. So, you know, to kick that off, Esther, it'd be great to hear from you about just sort of how we think about change overall. You know, if we're really taking, you know, this seriously, how do we need to think about transforming DEI?
Thank you so much, David. So when it comes to the science of change, there are three critical elements that need to be met in order for the change to really happen. You need to set the right priorities, then you need to reinforce them with the habits and support them with the systems. So what does that mean in organizations? When it comes to priorities, it is setting the right goals, as well as communicating those goals to employees, understanding that they hear you correctly, and then getting the leadership buy-in. So let's say we're talking about being inclusive leaders, and it is important for us to be inclusive leaders. What do the employees actually hear? Do they hear that it is important to be inclusive and understand what that means? Or do they suddenly start adding everybody to email threads or meetings that we've seen so many times? And in order for that not to happen, once we set a priority, we focus on the right habits. So we empower the employees and the leaders with the right tools in order to be inclusive leaders. And we'll talk a lot about how to properly form the habits and what is important in launching habit formation. And then the last most essential element is the systems. And the systems is like the ecosystem. It's the canvas for your organization. So it includes talent management systems and business systems, but it's also how you communicate with one another. And it's also diversity, equity, and inclusion systems, such as employee resource groups, diversity councils, ambassador programs, and we'll dive deeper into that too. But we wanted to start with priorities and talking more about how to set the right priorities. And we think that it will be essential for this year to really mobilize the leaders when it comes to the key priorities. So what does a mobilized leader look like? We think that it's three key elements that need to be met. The first one is that the leaders actually co-build and co-execute the diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy in the organization. So what I see a lot in talking to chief diversity officers is that we as practitioners actually create strategies, and then we try to get leaders on board. And you know, it's hard to get bought into somebody else's idea. So we think it's essential to be able to actually get the leaders on board and mobilize them prior to building the strategies, and then really build those strategies together with them. The second element is being active D&I ambassadors, and basically making sure that your leaders understand the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion for them, really embrace it, and that they're able to be ambassadors for diversity, equity, and inclusion for the whole organization. And the last part here is they take ownership and even better accountability for diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in the organization. But I would love to dig a little bit deeper into how to get that buy-in from the leaders. So passing it on to you, David.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's an interesting word, isn't it? Mobilize. You know, we were thinking about kind of what's the critical priority for DEI, and it's obviously, you know, you've got to find budget, you've got to do all sorts of things, but if your leaders are not mobilized, you're not going to get very far. And when we say leaders, we don't just mean your CEO and your C-suite and others. It's really everyone who manages people in any way. We think of leadership quite diversely. And then we started to realize this year that there's an interesting challenge in the way companies have been approaching this, because we've been helping firms mobilize leaders for about probably 6 years. I've personally done north of 400 kind of leadership briefings to try to get people across the line in that time. And we're really noticing a pattern. And one of the things I think has been really helpful is to realize that leaders are in really different places, and they're not necessarily in the place that you are. And there's a thing called the false consensus effect, where we assume that other people actually feel what we feel and, you know, have the motivations we have and know what we know. Right? It's also called the curse of knowledge. Once you know something, it's almost impossible to imagine or have the mind of not knowing it. And so what happens with a lot of DEI strategies is the people developing them are, passionate advocates, and they build an approach that would work for other passionate advocates, but may not work for others. And really, leaders are kind of across a bell curve, right? There are people that are passionate advocates who you can give them a little bit of insight, an emotional experience, a story, a tool, something, and they will run with it and do great things with it. There's probably a bigger group, and it's varying by organization, of people who are generally bought in but could go either way depending on how you approach them. And then there are people who are actively pushing back, and they might not be vocal about that these days, but they are definitely pushing back. And it can be really tempting to actually build a strategy for them as well. The squeaky wheel principle, attention tends to go to where there's, real problems. Also because of what we have what's called a safety bias, where we, put a lot of attention to things that could go wrong. So for a bunch of reasons, a lot of strategies end up focusing on those, the people who are the kind of real stalwarts who are not there, or the people who are passionate advocates. And we think that can be a challenge, not necessarily the right idea. I mean, it's important to remember that any change, even a really positive one that absolutely objectively people will get value from, about a quarter of folks push back actively. There's research on this. Even a really positive change, about 25% of people actively fight it, just on principle, because I don't like change, right? Remember Who Moved My Cheese sold something like 30 million books, and it's just a few cartoons. It's because, humans intrinsically, resist change, even really positive ones. So we have to be careful of kind of being at either end of this. And we think perhaps the right strategy is actually really focusing on the middle, and to expand that middle, broaden that middle, and also, create real normative effects that brings other folks along. So how do we do that? We've been thinking a lot about kind of the last 6 years and, what we've learned about how to mobilize leaders. And I'll give you some of the cliff notes of kind of what we've seen around mobilizing. And then we'll hear from the panelists in a couple of minutes. But, one thing, this is kind of obvious, but it's really important. And that is, as you're rolling out a diversity, equity, inclusion strategy, it does need to link to existing motivations and frameworks. So your business goals, your innovation goals, your values, your principles. It's got to fit like within the organization's DNA very cleanly, not this kind of thing that lives on the side. So it's very, very important that you're linking, any efforts in DEI to very central ideas that people already care a lot about. Now that's fairly obvious. We won't spend a lot of time on it, but sometimes companies miss this, and it's kind of this extra initiative or the thing for this year versus central. But the biggest factor in mobilizing leaders is not so much just how you position it, but how strong is the insight that people have, and therefore how strong is the commitment they have. How strong is the insight people have about the importance of DEI? And this correlates directly to how committed they are. And so we've been looking at kind of, or sort of unpacking the different strategies that companies use to try to kind of get people along. I mean, think about mobilize. What does it mean? The word mobilize, right? Making people mobile, getting people moving, right? How do you get people moving? Actually, insight creates movement, creates a real motivation for change. It's a moment when the brain actually changes. So what are the different strategies? Let's dig into number 2 for a moment. Let's dig into kind of what we're seeing happening out there. And I'll give you some kind of words of caution and some words of hopefully help as well. We see 3 approaches. There's one approach, first of all, which has been around for a long time, continues to be pretty common. It's not everywhere. A lot of companies have moved to number 2, but we still see this. And that is, you're a passionate advocate, and you express your passion, and you tell stories that really, really matter, and you're trying to harness people's emotional response. Now, folks who are already, many in the middle or many in the advocate stage, probably will resonate with this, but a lot of people won't. And the reason they won't is it's quite easy to start to feel 2 kinds of threats, right? And it doesn't matter if it's DEI or a religious person or someone passionate about a startup, or, people who are sort of almost evangelical in their enthusiasm create a reaction in us. There's a status reaction, which is, we feel like we're being told there's, they know something we don't, they're smarter than us. And so you can get a status reaction and an autonomy reaction, where we feel like we're being kind of told what to do or told how to think. So when someone kind of comes on quite strong, quite evangelical, and we feel like we're being told what to do, how to think, we can get quite a strong reaction. And that's not even taking into account, the political affiliations that people have and how you might get a reaction there. So the emotional buy-in strategy can work some of the time, but has some real dangers. Now, a lot of companies moved away from that and have moved into outcome studies. And outcome studies are sort of, we find this the most common strategy. So that's basically the business case. So we'll almost always turn up to a C-suite and they'll say, look, before we roll out a DEI initiative, can you show us the business case? Can you convince everyone of the business case? And we organized all the data around this, like you can't imagine. So financial business, like there's a financial impact that's crazy. There's an innovation impact. There's a go-to-market impact. There's a talent pool impact. That's what those 4 icons are. There's real hard data you can take to the bank that say absolutely diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives are good for business. And you know what? People read it and it doesn't give them an insight. People see it and they go, oh, that's interesting, but I still don't get it, right? Their felt experience is not that, right? And this is a challenge because we tend to go off our felt experience. We tend to go off what feels right? Not what kind of, we're told. And so we've done so much work on these, on the business case and just, refined it. We can tell you the top 10, like by ranks, studies in each of these categories that are really convincing, and they kind of aren't at the end of the day because the brains don't change. And what we found actually works, and then I will pause and we can talk about this. What we found actually works is actually treating people as adults and explaining the mechanisms at a team level of why it is that greater D&I actually makes teams smarter, but also why it is that you don't feel like that. And it's quite an important insight, sort of both, right? So there's 2 things. So why is it that greater DEI actually feels better? And that we wrote a whole paper on this called Why Diverse Teams Are Smarter. I'm not going to summarize all the points of that here. It's in the platform as one of the papers. It's also, you can just Google that term, you'll see it. It's an open document. My team will probably throw it in the chat right now as well. But Why Diverse Teams Are Smarter actually explains the mechanisms of how team IQ goes up when you have completely different points of view. And it's not just, finding problems or being creative. It's all types of thinking is actually improved. But the sort of 1-2 punch here, and the second punch is really important, terrible metaphor, but the second piece of this is really, really important. And that is that it literally doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like you're actually being smarter when you're in a diverse team. It's really odd. What actually happens is you actually feel less effective and you even feel less confident while you're actually being more effective. And it's I'm just thinking about it's almost like the opposite of alcohol, right? Alcohol, you feel more effective while you're being less effective. This is kind of the opposite. This is the second terrible metaphor I've used this morning. But it's you literally are getting smarter and feeling like you're not, right? So explaining these 2 things we think is really important as a foundation, and then kind of walking through that and actually literally explaining the mechanisms of how all this works. And then intelligent people, and mostly we have intelligent people running our organizations, we won't debate that, but intelligent people see it and get it and go, okay, now I see it, I'm willing to kind of try. So that's how we think the right way, that's what we think the right way is to create that insight that you need, because you need a strong insight. And then you need positive ongoing pressure to keep people paying attention. So the sort of first part and the last part is important, right? Links to motivations, positive ongoing pressure. But in the middle, are you actually getting people on board? Have you truly won their hearts and minds to get across? And so this is a summary of kind of what we've learned from, probably close to 1,000 briefings over the last 6 years or so, and kind of what works and what doesn't out there in the market. All right, let me shut up there, doing a lot of talking. Let's go to the panel. Maybe I'll turn this off. Your reflections, what's coming up? Soledad, looks like you're first off the queue. What would you like to
I was just unmuting first, but I'm happy to start. Everything you're describing in this idea of the emotional center and studies that are rooted in data, and then, what's the mechanism to explain, is you've just completely deconstructed how you do a documentary, of which I've now done about 50 some odd, right? But you always start with the person's story. You're not going to lecture people about the data. You start with the story of Jane Doe, and Jane Doe is a compelling character that you have to identify with in some capacity. Sometimes you can use people who are so despicable, you actually find them compelling to watch as well, and you want to see their transformation. Then you undergird that with data, right? The whole reason we're doing this story is because of these studies that show this. But I'm not going to ask you to read the studies. I'm just telling you that the reason we're doing this is because of these studies. You're just going to have to take my word on that. I think the key part is that mechanism, right? It's the deconstructing all of this in order to explain to people the reason why this is happening. Let me connect the dots for you, and you're going to see it all played out again through that, what we call in TV land, the character, right? The character has all the action happening, undergirded by some data, with the narrator basically saying, let me connect the dots for you so you can see something happening. It's why in a documentary, you might gasp when you see someone clearly making the wrong decision, right? Because we kind of know all the pieces as they head a direction. And so what you're really describing is what works well in storytelling. And I think that's very important, because often if leaders don't sort of understand that, they make a lot of mistakes in bringing something into fruition.
That's great. Thank you. And I think, when you're trying to mobilize leaders or, create a documentary, in both cases, you're trying to really move people. You're trying to get an emotional reaction that has people do something differently.
Hearts and minds.
Both, we're both in the mobilizing business in different ways. That's great. Linda, you want to jump in there? What's your perspective on mobilizing leaders? You've had some experience with this.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think about what people at BMS are really passionate about, it's a couple things that come to mind. It's science and research and data, and it's our patients. So, the science is something that was really a game changer for us. And we're all really familiar with the research that you cite and the research that people are very familiar with around the business case for D&I. And it got people to sort of that bell curve that you were showing, and that really resonated with me. People were generally bought in, but when we started to really personalize it for people, that's when they started to take notice. So when we started to talk about the business case in terms of our patients, it literally stopped people, and I could see people kind of sit up straighter in their chairs. So when I started to talk about our patients in terms of the fact that, Hispanic, Latino women have the highest rates of cervical cancer, that for all cancers combined, African American and Blacks had the highest death rates, that gay men are 40% more likely to be diagnosed with certain types of cancer, and that women are the chief medical officers of their families, that they're making 80 to 85% of the decisions for healthcare in their families. That's when people would literally stop me and say, well, what are we doing about it? We have to focus on that right now. And the same thing happened when we had that conversation about inclusion. And we started to talk about the science of inclusion and what was happening in the brain. So you think about, who's in our company. It's filled with scientists and researchers and physicians. And so when you talk about, what's happening in the brain, when you feel like an outsider or you're worried about bias happening, what's happening in the amygdala? What are you anxious about? And how is that affecting your ability to focus on making decisions and focus on performance? And how is that affecting your health? What's happening to your blood pressure and your heart rate? And it's making your palms sweat, and it's actually affecting your health. That was truly a game changer. And so, all of a sudden, it wasn't just kind of an intellectual exercise. That really tapped into everybody's passion. And so immediately they said, well, what are we going to do about it?
Right. No, that's great. You have to sort of tap into people's felt experience in a way, like where people can go, oh, I know that, I feel that. Oh, you've just explained something I actually see all the time. I'm thinking about, when we worked on your strategy, like it's definitely explaining the mechanisms, but also an additional piece to that is showing showing the sort of impact this has on real humans. And it's back a little bit to what Soledad was saying, that, when we're talking about the impact of inclusion, it's like, look, a team was going to do this. Someone actually did speak up, as a result, they found this, and this is the number of lives that we saved. For example, this kind of person actually is alive now because this human. So it's explaining the mechanisms and the outcome on real humans, and sort of showing the whole pathway from this is what might normally happen, this is what did happen, this is why it happened, this is what happened in their brain instead, and then these were the social outcomes. I think that's the pathway.
Exactly.
Yeah. Let's hear from some others. Barbara, you want to jump in? What's your perspective on mobilizing leaders? You've been involved in this a lot.
Yeah, thanks, David. And I really want to just double click on the conversation that we're having with respect to this, buying in and seeing it as this felt experience. And the example that comes to mind for me is actually with one of our clients. We have the fortune of assisting them with their D&I strategy. And so here we are in a meeting with the CEO and his direct reports. And so some information we had just presented to them in terms of findings and what we were hearing from their workforce. And it was so striking, David, to take part in this meeting. And actually, so first off, the CEO made certain that each one of his direct reports spoke on the topic. So he made sure that there was inclusion and everybody was heard. But really, the thing that I was left with most strongly was hearing the CFO speak at this meeting. So he shares this story both with his boss and with his peers. And in essence, it was this, you could see what you were describing earlier, David, this insight that he had and how it had made him more committed than ever. And I won't give the long version of the story, but the Cliff Notes version is he talked about, because he happened to be a Caucasian male. And so he talked about his experience of privilege and how he had essentially moved through his life, all the opportunities afforded to him, how he's able to, show up at work, he can speak up at meetings, just everything. Like for him, his normal reality, and thinking that that was everybody else's normal reality. So he had this fundamental shift and huge wake-up call, and he almost sounded like he had become an evangelist, essentially saying, because he was citing stories of exclusion stories, he had done what we would say from a science perspective, he was doing some perspective taking in terms of what that is like for people, and how tragic that is as compared to his own experience. And he really was like, he felt like an idiot of having led the sheltered life and being clueless in terms of the reality of others. And
Right.
so I share that story, David, because when we talk about this felt experience, like you've been describing with our audience, it's leaders like this, like those of us who are talent leaders, professionals who are so passionate about this work, what we want to see, the change take place. But it's when we get leaders like this who have this felt experience, they've made the connection because they've had this insight,
Right.
he will make a huge difference when he tells that stories with others and be pivotal in terms of helping bring the work along.
He's really got there himself. Now, because he's the CEO, people kind of have to pay attention. He has outsized influence, right?
Yeah.
But also when he tells the story, he's got to be a little bit careful not just to rely on emotions. He actually wants to also really explain to people how this actually works, because he'll still get some reactions. Interesting. A couple of comments coming in the chat, and then Esther, I want to hear from you as well. But a couple of comments just to clarify. The outcome studies are literally just if you add gender, if you add females to a team, they become smarter. If you add females to a board, you spend 15% less on purchases. If you, racial diversity has about a 35% bump in performance as against gender diversity, which has about a 15% bump in performance. So it's more just like, this is the financial impact. This is the impact on innovation. So they're kind of not what's inside the box. They're just like what's outside the box. So, company added DEI, this is what happened. That's what we mean by outcome studies, just so we have shared language. So company was more DEI, these results happened. Whereas what we're saying is actually explaining why this happened at the level of like meetings you would be part of every day. So mechanisms in things that are really relevant to you just about every single day. That's what we think really matters, explaining the mechanisms so people go, oh yeah, I do make some bad decisions by accident. Actually, it would be good to make less of those, or whatever their insight is. Esther, any comments there on mobilizing before we go to habits?
One of the biggest for me is just making sure that your leaders are actually mobilized. So I do a lot of briefings to leaders in the D&I space. And it's interesting because when I talk to the teams initially, they say, oh, no, everybody's bought in. And then when I go into the actual meetings, I realize that there is a bell curve, like you mentioned, David. So let me just be blunt. In current realities, the leaders will not say that they don't care about diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? They feel like this is dangerous, and they have a point. But we need to be able to see under the surface, and we need to be able to help every individual leader also craft their own story. I absolutely love what Barbara talked about regarding the CFO and the CEO that had that insight. So we need to be able to dig a little deeper and to actually help individual leaders connect to that emotionally and understand the true science behind it. Otherwise, they're going to act like they're bought in, but they're not really.
Right. Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. And I'll take one more question, just one more question before we go on. Just there's a couple of questions on mechanisms, because we could be a little clear on that. What I'm talking about is largely like what happens in the brain in like day to day that actually has us make poor decisions accidentally. So an example of a mechanism, and we write about this in the paper, Why Diverse Teams Are Smarter, is that, you know, you're with a group of people and you're making a big decision, but you're all quite similar. And so what happens is a thing called social loafing, where people just don't think very hard because they assume everyone else thinks like them and has done the work. And so they don't think hard to explain themselves, and they don't think hard to challenge each other's thoughts. Whereas with a diverse team, people literally work harder to explain themselves, and they actually challenge each other's perspectives more. And so ideas get actually challenged more. So you actually see fewer mistakes. And this is being tested really rigorously. You know, if there's an error in logic in an argument, a legal argument, an engineering argument, whatever, if there's an error in logic, a diverse team is much more likely to actually pick it up, because people are not just going, oh yeah, you know, Bob's always right, this is fine. And so they're literally working harder. And then you can sort of go click in and explain that more. But that's one example of a mechanism of, you know, and it is a story that you're telling, but it's also a story about a scientific process. And you can go a click deeper into the science, but really explaining to people either around bias or around inclusion or around speaking up, like in any of the domains, this is what goes on day to day that brains kind of get wrong. And this is how we need to then change that. And personally, we find at NLI, like doing that through the lens of just physical biology is really helpful. And maybe Esther, you can take us away through that. Let's go to the next chapter. I'll share some slides again. Let's go to the next chapter and talk a little bit about the second piece. We've talked about kind of how do you make DEI a priority, particularly how do you mobilize leaders? And our big insight there is really get them to you know, fully bought in by really understanding, like literally meeting by meeting, how this is relevant. Literally interaction by interaction, how this actually makes you smarter and better versus sort of conceptually with outcome studies. That's like literally understanding their brain as they're interacting with people. That's how you're going to get particularly senior leaders across the line. Esther, talk to us about the habits. Let's jump into this.
Yes, David. So when it comes to the habits, we actually need to make sure that we're reinforcing those rather continuously, and also make sure that they're fully aligned with the priorities and are supported with the habits. I would actually love for you to kick us off around facilitating the strongest insight, and then I'll go back to the habits.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, habits, we've been talking about this for a few years. Maybe many of you have seen this, but at NLI, our perspective is there are 3 legs to a tripod for something to become a habit. And these are, you can't miss one leg of a tripod or it falls over, right? And just in that same way, you need all 3 of these situations. What we like about these 3 conditions is that you can facilitate these in almost unlimited ways. This can be a standard workshop if you really have to. They're extremely effective. They can also be a series of podcasts. It can be a series of questions people ask. It can be a series of text messages. It can be like these ideas scale massively. and can be distributed massively in completely different ways. But these three conditions are critical. And one of them is that when you're creating a habit, let's say just a general habit of, being thoughtfully more inclusive or consciously more inclusive, right? Let's just generalize that as a habit, being consciously inclusive. To get people to that point, they need a strong insight. They need to have a moment where they go, oh, actually, being consciously inclusive is a really good idea. It's good for me. It's good for the business. It's good for my other goals. That's something I need to work on, right? So there needs to be a moment where they have that insight. If they have that insight and it's shared with others, either at the time or after, and it's really in their social network, they're massively more likely to act on that insight. It's more memorable. It's more accessible. They act much more often because of both how the memory is stored and also the positive social effects. So, sitting on your own, reading a book or sitting doing a class or something like that has a very small effect compared to having a big aha moment about inclusion and then sharing that with your team and kind of, taking that into your social world. It's a huge, huge, huge impact. And then the third thing that's really important is one habit at a time over time. And so even something like being inclusive is not just one habit, it's actually a series of things that you've got to remember to do. And you really need to learn those one at a time over time. And we've had a few sessions at the summit where we're kind of digging into this slide a lot more. There's one coming up later today called Impact, Scale, and Speed. If you're interested in kind of the mechanics of this, get along to that session. We have a session later today on measurement that goes further into that. So I won't spend much more time on this, but what we're interested at NLI is if you want to, if you actually want to do the right thing and do it right now, and you want to really take DEI seriously, what are the smallest sets of habits that you should work on? And this is a question we've been going over and over and over and over and over really for about 6 years. And this is where we are now. These are the critical habits that we think that everyone in an organization should have, and really common language across the organization. Do you want to walk us through that, Esther?
Yes. So just to level up, why those three? At NeuroLeadership Institute, we'll love to say that there is a big difference between diversity, inclusion, and bias mitigation, and we actually need to address them separately, right? So when we talk about it, we say that diversity is having a seat at the table, inclusion is having a voice, and bias is part of why some voices are listened to more than others. So really, you can have diversity and you can have diverse talent, but if you're not being inclusive, if you're not reinforcing the culture of speaking up and mitigating your own bias, then people will leave. And so from that standpoint, there are three sets of essential habits that need to be reinforced in the company-wide for all employees. The first one is that most people are actively mitigating bias every week. When we talk about bias, we actually talk about the importance of not just raising the awareness of bias, which actually might cause opposite results, but really reinforcing bias mitigation, right? So it is in the moment, it is those active acts of mitigating unconscious bias that really matter. The second set here is most people actively including every week. And we won't dive into specific habits around inclusion. I know that, for instance, with Linda, we actually did a lot of work in specifically identifying certain habits that fit within the culture of inclusion for their companies. I'd love to hear from you later, Linda, on that one. And then the third one is most people actively speaking up productively on behalf of themselves or others. That's where allyship comes in when this doesn't happen. And so if you're just getting started on the journey, what is important here is to pick a set of habits and make sure that you're reinforcing those and teaching those and creating that common language across the whole company. I would just love to talk a little bit more, David, around a brain-based approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it is important that every time you're reinforcing those habits, you actually reduce the reactions. So David talked about the fact that some of the conversations might be rather threatening or triggering. We need to make sure that we reduce that. And by following the science, we do that really well. For instance, in talking about the fact that everybody has bias and it's actually a biological process, right? So reducing threat and reducing reactions. The second part is you need to make sure that the training that you're launching is actually globally relevant. So we had an amazing session with the Chief Diversity Officer of Microsoft on allyship yesterday, where we talked about different levels of allyship, how you can really launch some of those programs to meet current challenges in the moment, or how you can make it a strategic imperative for the whole organization. And if you want it to be a strategic imperative, then you need to make sure that it's globally relevant. And the last part here is it really unites with common insights. So when it comes to leadership buy-in, when it comes to habit adoption, that insight is key and critical. And so we need to make sure that the training generates the most amount of insight and unites the participants through that.
Yeah, because there's definitely a reaction, particularly if you're in a global company, and, bear in mind, we're working with lots and lots of very large global, large multinational organizations, but although not just that, a lot of smaller local firms, schools, all sorts, but particularly in a global organization, you roll out a DEI initiative sort of from a North American headquarters, and everyone says, we don't have the same issues as you. In India, we don't have these issues that you have. In Africa, we have completely different issues than these. In the Middle East, you don't even start me. I mean, it's so very, very different experiences. And so when something is kind of anchored on more of a sort of social issue or a particular race or structure, it can be challenging. But when you strip that back and basically say, look, this is a brain issue. This is like talking about childbirth. We're talking about like the mechanisms of childbirth, talking about the mechanisms of bias. Doesn't matter if your hospital is in Rwanda or New York. You've got the same kinds of biases happening in your brain that can result in, accidental medical injuries, right? So we're talking about the level of biology. What it does is it reduces the tensions and just creates a common language with everyone everywhere. That's been really helpful. But I want to lift us up just so that we're all thinking at the same level of construal. As I see some of the questions, we're thinking about how do you change a company, and probably thousands of companies. How do you change a company? And so what we're thinking about at NLI is, what are the habits that you need to apply, and over how long, and in what order, and in what way? And so we're in the habit activation business at scale. I don't know if you saw the data, 13.5 million people that we've directly impacted in the last 3 years. So we're interested in how do you really scale habits? And for us, one of the things that's really important is that you're actually focusing on the right habits, that you're doing them, one at a time. Also, that as many people as possible are actually focused at the same time on that habit. That creates an enormous normative effect, enormous positive pressure. But there's also, what you've got to do is bring these habits alive for people. If you're talking about, let's be more inclusive, it's not just let's be more inclusive. It's like, as an example of a tactical habit, it's like, if you have people in a meeting, then make sure everyone is having a voice, perhaps by everyone, answering a question in the chat. This expression I use a lot, if you're in this meeting, then I want to actually hear from you. So can everyone please comment, about what I just said, in the chat right now? Like I want to comment from everyone about what we've just presented. And you got to tell people that ahead of time, but, requiring input from everyone, at least digitally, is an example of a practice or a habit that's very, very radically inclusive. And suddenly you go from just the loud people speaking to everyone actually having a voice, in every interaction, right? And so this kind of habit, the more people are doing this, the more it becomes normative and part of a culture, the more it becomes, kind of part of everything. But what you've got to do to bring this kind of habit alive is you actually need to tell people how it occurs in time and space. So the way we study habits is we think about their frequency and the threshold, so that we say, what's the frequency, what's the threshold? So if it's, for example, getting people to input in chat, which we call parallel processing, how often should that happen if you're, say, a mid-level manager? And the answer to that actually turns out to be like 10 times a week, easily. Easily 10 times a week, you should be getting people to put stuff in, versus 10 times a year or 10 times a month. Like, it's something you do like literally a few times a day. And then what's the threshold? When should you do it? When is it like obvious you should do it? What's on the line and maybe you should do it? And when is it really irrelevant? And so kind of showing people how this lives. And, bear in mind, we work with a lot of kind of STEM organizations, highly educated, quite concrete, kind of literal folks. So we don't want them to, spreadsheet this exactly, but we want people to picture the relevance of these habits in time and space. And when you can picture a habit and how often it occurs and when it occurs, you're actually creating this visual image, and it starts to actually live in your, not just your imagination, but your life. So as we're thinking about like scaling this, we're interested in this frequency question. And if you've been working with us for a while, you'll see that we actually measure this. Now, this is actual data from a pretty big rollout. I don't have the number exactly, but it's in the thousands of people in one financial services organization. And we basically went back at least a month after they'd finished learning anything and said, how often are you actively mitigating a bias? So you're seeing it and you're taking some action. And what we found was 62% 1 to 3 times a week, but nearly a quarter 4 to 6 times a week. That's that 23%. Now we only report out what we call BCP, which is the addition of 62 and 23 for an 85. And that's an impressive number, but think about a quarter of people you're touching actively mitigating a bias 4 to 6 times a week, which means pretty much every day. So now you're actually seeing real change in the organization, and 62%, nearly 2/3, at least once a week. So with this kind of measure, you can also start to kind of test different initiatives, test different strategies, see what works best first, which kind of faculty work best, which kind of delivery format, all these kinds of things you can really, really test and see what actually is possible. Now, I'll show you what we know as of today or as of last week in terms of these 3 habits. I'll tell you what's possible. If you think about it, what do you think is possible with mitigating bias? When we ask people that, it's in fact, we polled on day 1, I think 75% of people thought the best you could get is 50% of people activating a habit. So 3/4 of folks thought that 50% BCP was the highest you could get. I'll tell you, across bias, across over 9,000 managers, which means a very large population, 77% of those 9,000 managers across dozens of sites were deliberately mitigating a bias each week. So it's actually possible to do this and scale this. And also a number of these were just literally done in 30 days as well. 91% of 1,000 participants, and we're just doing a lot more work in bias clearly than inclusion at the moment, 91% were inclusive. And this is every week because we're polling them, did you just do this? Now, the 76%, and the reason it's only 50 was we just launched that solution formally in the last year, just getting our first data back. So we were only able to get clean data from an organization with 50 managers, but that's starting to come in now as well. So that's our voice solution. So it is actually possible. Almost all of these deliveries were 30-day deliveries. Almost all of this was actually working with thousands of people for 30 days. And you can get this kind of result. So, following the science, it is possible to make change much, much bigger than we thought. And you know what? We were all blown away by how quickly we could get to work from home, by how quickly we could get to like these radically changed systems in March. And, what else are we wrong about in terms of what's possible this year? And I think we're actually wrong about how quickly you can embed bias mitigation. All our data says we're really wrong about it because we just haven't been doing it the right way. And I'll leave you with kind of 2 provocations, then we'll talk about this. 2 provocations. The first one is, if you've got 20,000 employees, all our data says you should have 1 million acts of bias mitigation a year, 1 million. If you've got 20,000 people, it's 1 million acts of bias mitigation across business issues, strategic issues, people issues, all the people ones. And this is how we're going to get systemic change in our organizations. If you actually get just about everyone mitigating bias every week, and many people, many times a week, this is where the change happens. So that's, my provocation to you, my big provocation to you is what are you going to do in 2021? And if there's one thing that I want to sort of challenge you to do is get your whole organization building at least one habit, either bias or inclusion or speaking up. You can actually do all 3, but at least do one of those three things in 2021. And that's going to be doing something that impacts every employee. It's going to be doing it right now, and it's also going to be doing it right. So that's our provocation. Let me pause there. Let's go back to the panel. I'll stop sharing. We'll also take some audience questions this time, a little bit more. So please do throw in some audience questions. So Linda, you want to go first? What's your perspective on building habits? I know we did a lot of work on that with you.
Yeah, we did actually. It's been great. It's been a really fantastic partnership. And I'll say when we built our habits, we were fully bought into the concept and the framework, but we knew that we wanted habits that people at Bristol Myers Squibb really felt ownership for. And we wanted the entire workforce to feel like they owned them as well. And so we really engaged a set of employees to help us build those habits. And we have very engaged, what we call people in business resource groups. A lot of companies call them employee resource groups. And so the first thing we did in partnership was we engaged the leadership teams, the global leadership teams of those people in business resource groups. And we said, what are the cues that help you really feel most at your best? What are the cues in the environment that make you feel that you are in an inclusive environment? And so, through those conversations, and I remember being in rooms and putting things on stickies, and there were hundreds of stickies all over the place. We sort of consolidated those down to our own 3 habits, and then beta tested all of these actions that could help support those habits, so that when we did roll them out, we really felt like they were going to work across the organization. And we did it, we took our time. We beta tested them for 9 months and we rolled them out. And when we did, understanding that a company of 30,000 in, 45 countries, we wanted to do it, to your point, to scale, because we don't necessarily have patience. We wanted to do it effectively. We did it in a grassroots manner. And we wanted as many people that wanted to be engaged and to help create an inclusive workplace for everybody. And so we kind of put the call out there and said, who wants to be a part of this grassroots movement to create an inclusive organization where you can be at your best and everybody else can? And people jumped at the opportunity, and we had, in short order, over 1,000 inclusion ambassadors that wanted to be a part of this and role model, remind, and reinforce these habits. And so as we rolled them out one by one in the mechanism that you suggested, we had 1,000 ambassadors in 30 markets around the world that we helped to provide the guidance and the tools to help them do that. And then the markets just took ownership of it and ran with it. They were creating their own videos. They were doing it in ways that made sense within the markets. But so there was consistency in the habits, but then so much diversity in the way that they rolled them out. And so they would share what they were doing on our own internal social media. They painted the walls in Australia. They had sort of meet somebody Mondays in the UK, because one of our suggested actions was to once a week meet somebody that you didn't know well, share what you were working on to create connections across the organization. And it's been fantastic. And so we continue to improve it along the way, but it really just, it took on like fire.
I'll just give some context for folks, because it's a slightly different initiative. About half the work that we do out there when we're driving change initiatives is actually custom work, as we did with BMS. And what we did is BMS came to us and said, you guys are scientists, tell us the very best way. If we just focus on inclusion, not so much on bias, other things, but really focused on inclusion, tell us the very best habits possible to activate inclusion and the best structure to do that in. And we partnered to actually help create the brand and the story and some of that, but really more importantly, the critical habits. And we developed like a 3x3 that's very, very custom to BMS, that looks at exactly the kinds of habits, but then also very specific, like weekly things you can do. And so we went all the way down to these weekly practices that everyone should work on, and then rolled those out through the ambassadors across the business. It's a very wonderful custom solution. It's slightly different to say our include solution, which is that, or decide, which is directly on breaking bias. But it's kind of using us as consulting scientists to custom build the ideal framework. And we've done that a number of times. It ends up being about half our work. Thanks, Neda. Soledad, tell us, from your perspective, a million moments of bias mitigation, or some of the data that I've shown, or anything you want to address, what's coming up for you as you think about following the science there?
Yeah, I was asked to convene a conversation at a big insurance company. And I have found, and I'm sure you see this in your data all the time, most people say, well, but I'm not biased. I'm a good person. I absolutely include people. I love people. I
Yeah.
have a black best friend. You hear that a lot. So one of the things that I think that they were trying to figure out was like, so how do you break through that to get to the insight without making people feel uncomfortable, right? Which will automatically kind of shut everybody down. And so it was fascinating. They had a black executive, very high-ranking guy, who is a lovely, charming, fantastic, handsome dude. And he told the story, almost jokingly, about he had heard a noise in his basement, high-ranking guy. And he said, I went downstairs and my back door in the basement was open. And he goes through this thing, again, very charming demeanor. And he says, and I sat there thinking, do I call the police because maybe someone's broken into my house? And do I risk getting shot? Or do I just close the door and risk that there's someone in my house? And it was told so poignantly, although he was not trying to over dramatize it. I think it was such a tremendous insight for people who knew this guy. He was very, very popular. And from that, I think it was the first time that people began to believe, like, oh, maybe this is all in the George Floyd killing time. They don't think of him as anything like George Floyd. And they began to have this insight like, oh, that actually I do have some bias when it comes to certain people around how I feel about them. He is great and he would never be subjected to anything like this, but other people are not. And I think that insight led to the formation of habits, one which was, feeling freer to stand up and point things out because they had such an emotional turn inside of them that I think they really, really got it. And of course, beginning to be more self-aware about their own bias, because without that self-awareness, I'm not sure that they could take the first steps to mitigating it. I think part of it is a little bit like you have to admit you have a problem, or even if it's a brain problem, but admit that there is something that you see in yourself. So I thought that was a pretty fascinating example of an insight leading to a real commitment to have it change.
That's great. That's great. It's a great example. Thank you. I mean, we really do our very best to steer away from telling people that they're biased, or particularly that they're racist or sexist or anything else. We really steer away from that. And, this was kind of tested when the government mandate went out about, not doing, bias training that puts any race down, when that sort of edict went out. So we didn't end up losing any work. We're doing a lot of work with government. So because we're not sort of demonizing any audience or making anyone feel bad. But the approach that we're trying to take there is, firstly, when we talk about bias in particular, we actually talk about this is about decision making. So business decisions, have just as much bias as, say, hiring decisions, and we'll often come in through that pathway and say, like, look, have you ever had a business decision like, how much you decided to invest, or a company you decided to buy or not buy? Or we were at one of the major movie houses and we said, hey, let's look back at your greenlighting decisions and which ones you regret. That was very telling with the CEO and the top team of one of the biggest movie houses. And, so we start with where the pain is and we say, let's look back on decisions you've made and which ones were bad decisions and why. And did you look back and go, oh, I missed that? How many times did you look back and say, oh, I missed that data and I had the data, versus, oh, I just didn't have the data? And a lot of the times people had the data, but they were just not noticing it, right? We're like, oh, okay. So that's where, if you'd asked, multiple people, you may have seen this, right? That's where if you'd taken this kind of action, you might have been different. So we'll try to help people unpack, like, ideally business decisions. Well, the way I'll open with a CEO is like, hey, have you ever made a decision that you felt really right about at the time and later discovered you were really wrong about? And they all just shake their head and say, oh my gosh, too many, and we start to unpack those. So we'll sort of try to come in through that and say, look, here's the reason, because, your conscious brain is about a cubic foot. Your unconscious is the Milky Way by comparison. Even if you know everything about bias, you're going to expand the foot maybe to 3 feet, still got the Milky Way you can't access. So without the help of others, and without tactically mitigating bias, you're always going to make, lesser decisions. You're always going to make these mistakes. So we try to sort of, meet people where they are, and say, look, brains have bias. It's not your fault. And by the way, you don't feel that you're biased. That's correct. Our research shows that you don't feel that you're biased, but I bet you feel everyone else is, don't you? And everyone says yes. And so that's just another example of how the brain works. Everyone sees everyone else's bias, but not our own. That's normal. So we sort of normalize all these processes, and then kind of have people go, okay, so maybe I would like to get across. But stories like yours, Soledad, also tremendously helpful, especially if people really relate to that person. You know, these kind of emotional stories plus the science, the combination of those, I think, is really powerful. Barbara, you want to jump in there? Just talk a little bit about your experience with habits, or whatever's coming up for you around habit activation at scale in particular.
Yeah, David, thank you. What's coming up for me as we're talking about scaling habits within organizations, and as you talked about how we do this work with clients, is also we've got to be prepared for what we're not expecting as part of this process and have a growth mindset around it. And what I mean by that is, so I was reading a piece where the global head of diversity and belonging at Atlassian, she was talking about how just for some people in the environment that the words of diversity and inclusion can really bring up threat or bring up a strong reaction in people. And she shared the example of how they had done a survey, collected some data, and there was a gentleman who responded and said, you know what, I'm a white male and I always feel like I'm on the wrong side of diversity. And so her response was perfect in terms of, what it meant for her was, some of the feedback that he had shared represented a real misunderstanding of what the organization was looking to accomplish. And also she could see how some of the definitions and some of the language were actually getting in the way in terms of the work that they were trying to do. And I reference that because we see this in the work with our clients. And so Justin, as an example, when we go to formulate the groups for focus groups, right? So what do the demographics look like? And so you get the list of, okay, we have persons of color, we have women, we have LGBTQ, like we get the long list. And so I'm looking at the list and I go, where's the group for the white males? And then you get this deer in the headlights look, like, oh my God, how could we miss that? And so it's just making sure that obviously we want to make sure that we're having the groups when we're doing this work, that we make sure we have the representation across the organization first of all. And then secondly, because we might get some input or some reaction that feels like this is somebody who really is a detractor from this work, not necessarily. It's an opportunity for us as talent leaders to hear them, to really lean in and listen, to understand what is it that we're missing. Rather than being quick to say it's that person, is it something we need to look at differently in terms of the language that we're using, the messaging that we're doing? Those persons can actually help us so that we can reach more people as part of this work. And so I just want to add that too, just again, because it comes up a lot in terms of really kind of missing some of those key voices that really we need to hear from. And secondly, not to just be quick to just dismiss people as part of this process.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're trying to include everyone. And, one of the mantras we have in our inclusion work is if you're not actively including, you're accidentally excluding. Exactly. And so really, you're thoughtfully, actively including without over-including. I want to go on. I see where we've got quite a few good questions coming in. I want to make sure we get to the systems perspective. Let me just summarize the habits work and just say that, our intuitive hunches about building habits are actually not correct. From the data that we see, it's actually possible to do incredible things with habits if you follow those three principles: strong insight in social situations, one habit at a time over time. It's possible if you leverage managers and give them good tools that you can scale this across a whole company very, very quickly. It's possible to see real change, especially if you're impacting large audiences at once, where you really are building new practices that everyone starts to apply. You can get everyone in a company where most leaders now speak last in a meeting, for example. You can do that pretty quickly if you scale these things across the organization. That's where you get this systemic change. And I'll just say one last thing, just in terms of a question that came in. This is an incredible time to be in the change business, because actually with everyone or most people like used to learning in this style, you can actually do learning that's dramatically more effective than when we had to meet in person. Now, you did hear that correctly. I'll actually tell you the data. 19% more people are actually building habits using this approach than when we had to do workshops. So we have a 19% increase in habit activation doing learning this way. When you actually take like a 3-hour in-person workshop and turn it into 3 1-hour virtual sessions, you should get about 7 times as many actions taken as a result. We've done that research and thought experiment as well. So before COVID, we were 78% virtual delivery. All the work we were doing, we went to 100% pretty quickly, because this is actually the better way to deliver learning. So don't think like this is a time that you can't do much. Actually, this is an incredible time to do big change, but just one habit at a time. And, you know, talk to us more, come to the other sessions today to learn more. There's some amazing case study sessions. There's some amazing sessions on measurement, on like impact, scale, and speed. We're just kind of going a little bit on the surface here, but I want to talk about systems. We've talked about priorities and habits. Actually, I don't want to talk about systems. I want Barbara and Esther to talk about systems. I've done enough talking already. Let's talk about systems and the third piece of the puzzle: priorities, habits, and systems. Over to you guys.
Thank you so much, David. So I actually want to start by raising a few questions that came up. So somebody asked us, a leader told me he feared hiring a Black candidate because he feared they would suffer bias and sell less. And there are a lot of questions that are coming in around that. And one of the biggest insights that a lot of organizations had following the George Floyd murder is in holding the listening sessions with their employees, they realized that when it comes to people of color working inside organizations, working inside companies, it is not that direct racism that is a challenge. It is that they feel like they don't get promoted at the same level. They don't feel like they get equal opportunities. They don't feel like they get hired. And all of that actually lives in the systems piece of organizations. And one of the biggest aha moments, which we knew, but now there was no way to not see it, was that people don't just leave their prejudices and biases behind when it comes to entering the virtual world of work or entering the office. It still exists in the workplace. And so from us as leaders, it is important to start looking at, are we actually reinforcing some of the habits or going against the habits when it comes to the systems? And in the next slide, you can see some of the systems that we talk about. And here it's really 2 approaches. The first one is to almost do an inventory and cleanup, right? So look at all of your existing important systems within the organization, whether it is talent systems like talent acquisitions, promotions, performance management, or business systems, how you manage your supply chain, how you manage your suppliers overall, right? How you reach your communities, etc. So that's the first part, is do the inventory list check and look at whether or not there's some biases or some potential lack of inclusion inside those systems, and then reinvent them. And the second big piece is, okay, what can I do now that diversity, equity, and inclusion is a priority to install the right system within the organizations? So Linda just talked to us about the ambassador programs, right? Another good one is, if you don't have employer resource groups, if you don't have business resource groups, again, make sure that you introduce those. Look at whether or not you have proper succession planning, mentorship, sponsorship, because those are the critical elements to make sure that you actually have equal opportunities for everybody inside your company, and you also hire people equally. So I want to dive a little bit deeper into it with you, Barbara, and look at talent management systems and how we can rework talent management systems through those filters.
Yeah, Esther, as you know, we do so much work in this area in helping our clients, and we have a few examples to share with the audience. So the first one is around the system that you're reviewing, and we use calibration meetings in the performance process to highlight or illustrate this. So here you have research shows roughly about 43% organizations use calibration meetings. So that's the stage where, you know, there's the the association is done in terms of of employees inside of the organization, how they're ranked by different leaders and what have you. And so this process or this practice is in place to really have these teams use a set of standards, really help individual managers to help them in terms of reducing bias, and make sure that their ratings distribution is fair. And the interesting thing is, it can still be a very biased process. It is a very biased process. So that's just one example that we see in terms of talent. Secondly, is how decisions can be made that can either favor or disadvantage specific groups. And earlier this year, shortly after the pandemic, David and I met with a CDO who was talking about how they were having an impending RIF, and she was really concerned about the decisions that were being made and the implications for persons of colors, color, women, so individuals that are part of underrepresented population. And so it just goes to show how in their minds, without her intervention, they felt like they were using objective criteria to make these decisions, but not looking at the implication. And she, of course, was holding all of it. And so she wanted to put in place, what are criteria that I can use to immediately help them? I want to fix this for, what I'm facing right now with them, but also for the long term as well. And then also in this process, in terms of looking at systems, we see how with threat and bias, how it surfaces. And we talk about it in terms of the various types of biases, right, that we know leaders experience, whether it's similarity, I make decisions based on people being like me, expedience, because I just need to move and do it quickly, the shortcuts that the brain is making, or based on my experience, because we hold a belief that we see reality objectively and accurately when obviously we don't. And of course, safety bias, just like Esther, what you was just mentioning, the person who didn't want to hire a Black salesperson for fear of that person being discriminated against. And so it's just recognizing these are the types of biases that come up. And so we want to help leaders with what we call just buffering, things that they can do also for themselves to deal with their own threat when they're faced with these decisions. And then lastly, how to redesign the system so that the system inherently actually reflects this language that we're talking about, so they can understand from a systems standpoint how to really assess what types of biases are there, and then be able to look at what are new practices and processes that can be put into place that really is going to help the organization be more effective at really addressing these issues. And so this work that we do, one of the tools that we use is something called a coherence analysis, because we're helping organizations really look at their systems and understand what's the intent in terms of what they expect the system to cover. And we assess that or contrast that against what's the reality, what's actually happening. And with coherence, from a science perspective, we mean that in terms of what we call the structural integrity of ideas, which translated means how are things fitting together? Is what you say is the intention of the system what's actually the experience of the workforce and for your leaders? And so we're showing you the different areas with which we do this work. And also for each of these areas, there are also a series of sub-processes that we are in fact taking a look at. And how we go about doing that work, of course, just depends from one client to the next in terms of where they want to focus. But the outcome of that work is essentially just a report that helps organizations see where the work needs to be done. Sometimes the CHRO wants to understand what's happening. In other instances, the CHRO wants to use those findings to help the organization see what needs to be made a priority and the resources that need to be made available.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I think that it's also very important in the work that we do around coherence analysis that we actually hear from the employees, right? So we hold the focus groups and we hold the executive interviews, like what you mentioned earlier, and make sure that everybody's voice is included. So it's not just us reviewing a system, but rather it's us seeing how the employees actually experience certain systems and how we can navigate through that experience to make it more equitable. When it comes to the business systems as well, there's a lot of data now showing that with diverse teams, you make much less mistakes. Some of the examples that come to mind here is everything around computer vision, right? So facial recognition technology is right now rather biased. And we need to make sure that when launching certain products or when entering different markets, that we take into account the diversity of the teams that are building those products to make sure that the products actually serve our customers best. And I know, Soledad, that you, when you and I chatted, you had an amazing example there with Netflix pretty much taking over the space. I would also love to hear from you, if you don't mind, about that example.
Yeah, absolutely. You know what's interesting in TV news and in production generally, one of the ways the hiring system has worked is to say you need a diverse slate. And you talked about how employees might look at this system and sort of how that helps them or sometimes fails to help them navigate it. What we found a lot of was a sense of a diverse slate was needed. And instead of actually encouraging people to hire of the 5 or 6 diverse people they brought in, they knew if they could just get through the diverse slate, everybody has to interview this person, check, 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 check. Now I can go hire whoever I want to because I've gotten the pass because yes, in fact, I did hire the diverse slate. And so what I found was that as a person of color, I'm often asked to add people to this diverse slate. 5th or 6th time, you stop adding your friends to the diverse slate because they're constantly being rejected because the job's already been filled. They just haven't filled it officially. And so what ended up happening was so fascinating to see Netflix actually going to those people who had all those connections and saying, we're going to put you in charge. We no longer need you to have the diverse slate. We want you literally to bring in all your friends and start coming up with ideas, and we're going to give you a platform to do this. And I think we've seen really Netflix would be the leader in this, in that they literally go out with a ton of money and hire all of these folks who are absolutely being incredibly innovative about the storytelling and about the way in which they're creating the stories. So, for example, now we all binge, right? So everybody drops an entire season at one point so that you can watch, show after show after show after show after show and never click off of Netflix. I think that was a really brilliant idea on their part because they were able to pick up on what others were leaving behind because they were not beholden to seeing the holes in the system. The diverse slate fails. It really does fail if you don't hold people accountable. And if you don't, and you guys haven't talked a lot about measuring within the organization, but I think you have to track and measure and track and measure to see if all of these things are really happening.
No, that's great. Thanks very much. I know we've got about less than 10 minutes left. I wanted to address some of the questions and just kind of bringing us back a little bit to where we started, that we think 2021 is the year to do things right and do things big. And we think that the way to do that is mobilize leaders the right way, get them focused on the right habits, but as few as possible in the right order. And don't fear that this is a bad time for doing real change and real learning work. This is actually the best time. You can do faster, cheaper, better, more impactful learning experiences now than you will be able to in 2 years. This is actually the time to really leverage the moment. But you also need to really take the systems seriously and make sure that changes are really embedded in the day-to-day practices of how you hire, of how you promote, of how you reward, of how you recognize people, all those kinds of things. Actually, in the systems, you want to make sure that there are inclusive practices and ways of mitigating bias. We've actually, in the last few years, started doing assessments of talent systems directly against bias. We've been helping a number of firms with that. So we'll actually look at your whole talent pathway and say, at a system level, where do you accidentally have bias, and take that out. It's some really interesting work. But some closing comments. It'd be good to hear from each of you. Some closing comments as you think about being really strategic, and maybe even, as came up yesterday morning, maybe even being a revolutionary around DEI. We talked about that in the Build a Better Normal session yesterday. This is possibly the time to do more change than you've ever been able to do in your career. And most of you listening to the session, I would propose, are change agents. So this is actually the best time to create big changes, because systems are unfrozen, people are open, and there's a greater awareness of the importance of the human more than ever before. So as we think about kind of being even revolutionaries, what's your final word on this? What do you want to close with? Linda, we go to you first.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's going to sound revolutionary, but
All right.
we've all been saying that this is a moment in time that I think it's safe to say that none of us have lived through before, and will hopefully never live through again. But it's certainly incumbent on all of us who sit in positions like this to take advantage of the moment, where we're all paying attention and we sit in positions where we can influence large organizations. And, because of that, we have an opportunity, and I think the way I look at it is to change the way that people speak. And so one of the things that we're really focused on is changing the language, and we're having what we're calling, courageous conversations. But in large part, what we're building into our habits going forward is an opportunity to be courageous, and which obviously takes being vulnerable and stepping into some really uncomfortable conversations, and changing the language in that, having some grace when we step into that conversation, and allowing those conversations to be really clumsy and messy. And so as much as we want to learn and be perfect and find it and make it fantastic, let's not wait to do that. So your point about do it now, or do it right, or do it right now. Let's just do it right now, and let's be really kind to one another.
No, that's great. Thank you. We've been thinking a lot about clumsy conversations this year, and the importance of just having them rather than saying nothing, and moving forward. Thanks, Linda. That's great. Someone else, closing thoughts as we think about this revolutionary opportunity ahead, even though we're all a little exhausted, leveraging this moment. Soledad, what comes up for you?
Just a quick thing to add to what Barbara had said earlier about maybe white men feeling like they're a bit left out of the conversation. And I might argue, I think white men are the biggest lever in the conversation. I think that really turning that on its head and saying you're in a lot of ways the most important piece, because once white guys really embrace the concepts around this, I think they have tremendous power to change the conversation, because you change the messenger dramatically. So I think that would be my conversation to have with people who are feeling a little bit a certain way about conversations around diversity.
No, that's great. Thank you. That's very true. Barbara, for you? Any closing thoughts?
Yeah. For me, David, it would be, as you said, here's this time that we're in that is unprecedented, and it certainly is ripe with opportunity, as we know. And so I would suggest to our audience to seize the moment by experimenting, because we see in conversations with clients. Last week, I was presenting to a group, and the person asked, from a hiring standpoint, should they mask, right, the identifying information based on some research we had shared about candidates who had names that sounded, more ethnic versus names that didn't. And so her question was, is that something that we should in fact do? Because she wanted to be able to say NLI said, right, to go back to her leadership. And what I said to her was, do it. Like, do a pilot, do an experiment, try it for yourself, right, and see. You do the comparison, and then you have your own data firsthand from your organization. And I don't know, David, I don't think organizations could have gotten away with that a year ago, but right, now we can. And so that's what I would encourage our audience to do, is just to try more things out.
Follow the science, experiment, and then follow the data.
Yeah.
What a great idea. Follow the science, experiment, and then follow the data in every
novel, David.
What a crazy idea, right? What a crazy idea to close with. Esther, any closing comments there?
For me, it's follow the employees and listen to your employees. And when you're launching the programs, make sure that you're giving the tools to all employees to really drive for a massive shift within the organization. We're going to see, well, in this country, in the United States, we're going to see a lot of division. And I am excited actually to be in the role that I'm in, because by investing in inclusion, investing in allyship, and bringing people closer together around human values, we can actually transition through that period much better, hopefully, in 2021.
Yeah, not to get political to close, but there's a lot of division. I think done right, where you're focusing on this is what brains do, and you're not talking about privilege, and you're not even necessarily talking directly about racist issues. But if you actually can come in and say, look, this is what brains do in all kinds of decisions, you can get just about everyone on board. That's been our experience, and bring people together. No one wants to make bad decisions that cost an organization time and money. And even in government agencies, Lisa Squibb was asking about that. Even in government agencies, you don't need to actually talk about privilege or race to actually make a big difference in bias. You can actually come in for a very different frame. And we've been able to do that with some very large agencies. But this is a year to be a bit of a revolutionary. Here's a revolutionary idea to close with. Follow the science, experiment, and then follow the data. There it is right there. Do small experiments in your company. If we can help with that, great. Do them on your own, great. Tell us what you did so we can all learn as well. Thanks very much, Esther, Soledad, Barbara, Linda. So appreciate us all being in this conversation together. This is definitely a conversation we have together with scientists and organizations and everyone. And it's been an exciting year to see that the investment of the last 7 years has actually been helpful to reduce bias overall. And it still feels like we're at the beginning. There's a lot more we have to learn as well. But thanks everyone for being here. Thanks all listening, and look forward to watching lots of revolutionary out there. Lots of revolutionaries out there making change. Thanks very much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, everyone.